All right, everybody, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hope everyone had a good lunch. You could have a seat. That'd be great. So this is a session about resource adequacy assessments, especially looking over large geographic areas or wide area assessments. We have a great panel up here. Derek Stenclik from Telos Energy is going to moderate the panel and introduce the rest of the speakers. Derek, I've known Derek for a few years now, and you've always enjoyed working with him. He's a co-founder of Telos that started in 2019. Derek is great because if you've ever been on a phone call with him, he really loves to argue with you. So that's always makes the call a little bit more exciting. And then with that, I'll turn it over to Derek. Thanks, Derek.
Thank you, Chu. And yeah, it's not arguing as much as it is heated debate. But I'm excited for this panel. I will say I was going to be on the panel, and I've either been, we'll go with demoted down to moderator, but I still have a few slides. I've cut my slides. I'm going to kick off with a little bit of a presentation and then go into moderator mode. I'm excited for this for a few reasons. I mean, one, a great panel we have for you. The second is we're keeping it light on slides. We want this to be conversational. We're going to start out with 5, 7, 8 minutes of slides and then move over to more of a conversation and a debate. So that's another reason I'm excited. The third reason I'm excited is I actually don't think we need to say data centers or AI, like maybe the whole time. So like maybe we'll get like the swear jar up here. And I think everything here is very useful, applicable certainly to data centers, AI, but useful in either context. So I hope that'll be a good break for some folks. So again, my name's Derek Stenclik with Telos Energy. I'm going to present or kind of kick this off with a task force that we participated in, led with ESIG on wide area resource adequacy assessments. So the report just came out. You may have seen it. If you haven't, you can go take a look at it on the table out here. This is from about 2 weeks ago. And it's really the fourth in a series of reports that the redefining resource adequacy task force came out with. So go back to 2021, 2022 timeframe. We started out with the redefining resource adequacy for modern power systems. That was kind of the seminal work for the task force, and just looked at how, with the changing resource mix, changing load profiles, what and how resource adequacy analysis had to change and evolve. Went into the second paper there, really around accreditation of resources and procurement, how we should be measuring relative resource adequacy contributions of different resources. The third paper came out last year around the reliability criteria. Where did the 1-day and 10-year LLE come from? What are some other criteria we could be considering? What are the pros and cons of each of those? And how should we think about measuring whether or not a portfolio of resources is reliable? And the one we just released, the fourth paper in that series, really around wide area resource adequacy assessments. So how can we think about applying the probabilistic resource adequacy framework to much wider geographies? Why might we do that? What are the benefits of doing that? And how can we recognize interregional transmission contributions in that context? So that first paper really laid out 6 principles. So that the paper walked through 6 different principles of resource adequacy and how it's changing. That we covered in those subsequent papers each of those other domains. So of the 6 principles, we had 5 of them covered, and we wanted to hit this 5th principle, which is neighboring grids and transmission are a key part of the resource adequacy challenge. We saw that most regions were really improving the way they were managing and evaluating their portfolio of resources or their transmission system for resource adequacy, but it got a little sketchy when you went to the peripheries, right? You got to the edge or the boundary, and oftentimes they weren't acknowledging what was going on outside their borders at all, or if they were, it was with a kind of representation. And we're seeing a big benefit to moving outside of just one local footprint and starting to do things both on a regional framework and a much more larger interconnect-wide or continental framework. And so that's what we wanted to look at, is how do we define this? How do we think about this? How do we come up with best practices for doing these really wide area assessments? So first of all, you're going to hear wide area a lot, and we try to come up with some clean terminology. So local assessment, that's a probabilistic resource adequacy assessment for just one utility, one ISO doing their evaluation for their system in isolation. A regional assessment is one that's conducted by a group of neighboring utilities or ISOs. So we have folks up here from NYISO and NPCC, Northeast Power Coordination Council, and they've been doing this for a long time, right? The regional assessment, taking the 4 regional entities and planning together. And then a wide area assessment is just taking that one step further and looking at this at a very large geographic scale, the size of the interconnect or continental scale. And really what matters here, a couple things, getting to a system that is larger than the weather impacts. So even on some of those regional assessments, you could have extreme weather hit the entire footprint at once. When we go out a little bit wider, you start to see more opportunities around this geographic diversity. And we start to think about how interregional transmission can play a role in that. So when we were putting together the task force, putting together the paper, a lot of it, my first gut reaction was, well, we could just have one slide. It could just be an arrow pointing to Europe and say, do what they're doing, right? So Europe is, for the last 5 or 6 years, been very far ahead in this. They do what's called the ERA, the European Resource Adequacy Assessment. It brings together over 40 transmission system operators, 36 different countries, and they do a coordinated plan. Right? They're looking out 10 years and saying, what does the resource adequacy look like at a continental scale? And how can we standardize the methods and data sets and assumptions that go into these studies so that we can do this planning collaboratively across the continent? So similar data sets, I will say, like, the key thing here is it's not only work being done or evaluation done at the continental scale. It's really looking at how do you combine local assessments. Each of these TOs, each of these countries are still doing their own local assessment. We're not trying to replace that. But how do you add that layer of the continental assessment to make sure these local entities, these countries, and these TOs are planning, knowing what's happening at their borders? There's a lot of change going on in the industry today. Nobody's going to dispute that. We want to make sure that when you're doing your assessment of your region, you're taking into account those changes that are happening in the neighbors. So today, there's not quite a comparable process to what they're doing in Europe. I think a lot of great practices that we can learn. I'm sure there's a few folks from the ERA team here today. Certainly, we're a part of the task force and great to have their input. So why should we be thinking about wide area assessments? The first, these are somewhat ranked. We asked the task force, we asked several folks in presentations what their highest priorities were for wide area assessments. The first comes down to interregional transmission planning. We've seen a large uptick in recognizing the benefits transmission can bring for resource adequacy. And the problem is we can't really measure those benefits if we don't have this wide area assessment. If there's no resource adequacy model or resource adequacy process at the continental or interconnect level, we're fundamentally going to be missing opportunities around interregional transmission planning. Second is really around making sure we're doing planning and coming up with scenarios that are consistent across local and regional planning. We want to make sure we can compare apples and apples of what's happening across the system. And in that kind of brings me to point 3, making sure that if we're planning the system in NYISO, we want to make sure we have a good representation of the changes that are taking place, not just in the NYISO market, but in the neighboring markets as well. And so I think that's a key portion of this. Assessing policy impacts more and more becoming not just a local impact, local policy, but national or continental policy. And really starting to look at external assistance during RA events. How much can we lean on a neighbor if we need to for resource adequacy? And how does that change in extreme weather events that might span large geographies? And then lastly, I think just in Europe, just the methodological and metric alignment. Again, not saying we have to have the same reliability criteria, the exact same process in each region, but to the extent that we can harmonize some of those processes, makes it easier for all of us to go transact business across different regions or think about planning the interconnected system that we have. So I'll kind of refer back to this throughout the Q&A, but there's really a two-way flow of information. Again, this is not just meant to be top-down planning. It's supposed to be bidirectional, right? It's at the top here, the local utilities, ISOs, and regions are sharing information and data and assumptions up to the reliability organization or the centralized resource reliability organizations. And then the opposite is true, right? Just as important is that reverse flow of information. How can we take that aggregated data and have it be useful to the local entities? And we're going to be talking about that a lot during our Q&A here. And then lastly, it's not just about the reliability organization and the utilities and RTOs. It's really kind of at every step of the level. How do we bring in the states to have really critical say in this process? How do we bring in different stakeholders, and what does that look like? So that, I'll kind of pause here. Like I said, when we started this study in this task force, it was really like, hey, let's look at what Europe is doing as best practice. And now we're starting to see that translate into some of the work that's being done at NERC and in the North American context, where before there's really no wide scale resource adequacy study. I think this is a spot where a lot of the material that's in the report does seem, it's one of those, it seems obvious once you write it down and put it in one place. The question is, well, why weren't we doing it? And so we are starting to do that. So of all the work I've done, it seems the most obvious and fundamental at the time, but it's one that's also actuated a lot of change in a process that's currently underway with the NERC. They call it the pilot study to do this interconnection-wide resource adequacy assessment, probabilistic across the entire continent, kind of, again, driving home consistent methods, consistent models, consistent metrics across the system. Before, it was a regional assessment in the Prob A, but now starting to do that across the wide areas. So with that, I will switch over, put my moderator hat on. Again, I'll do one introduction for everybody, and then we'll just allow folks to come up. So first off, Sarah Edmonds, President and CEO of Western Power Pool, is going to be talking about a lot of the really unique applications of not just wide area resource adequacy planning and doing the assessments across the Western US, but again, how do we translate that into actual capacity benefits and resource sharing across the footprint? Andrew French, Chair of the Kansas Corporation Commission, I think giving us a great perspective of what I just talked about. How does the state have a role in the resource planning at the local level? And then how does that zoom out to the regional level at SPP? And then what are the opportunities? I think SPP is a great spot in the interconnection. It's the only ISO that borders all three interconnections of the East, West, and ERCOT. So really unique application there. And then we'll move things closer to the Northeast. Katoon Zanat, Manager of Probabilistic Assessment at the Northeast Power Coordinating Council, doing that regional assessment of the four Northeast regions of Quebec, Maritimes, New England, New York, and Ontario. So 5. I got it. There we go. And then Dylan will talk about how the local assessment in NYISO and that coordination with NPCC works to really take that top down and bottom up approach. So with that, I will pass it over to Sarah Edmonds.
Good afternoon. Good to be with you. It's a weird week for me, and I'll explain why in a moment when I talk to you more about the Western Resource Adequacy Program, which is, in my view, the West's answer to how do we do a wide area assessment of resource adequacy for all parts of the West outside of California, not only to understand where the West truly sits in terms of its capacity adequacy, but how do we allocate that responsibility and then share that burden, leverage the diversity of this tremendous footprint to deliver a more efficient resource adequacy solution if we act together. First, a couple words about us. Western Power Pool, we are not an ISO, an RTO. We are not a reliability organization. We are a nonprofit 501c6 that has been working for decades on decades with a lot of the utilities listed on this slide, coming up with planning and operations coordinating frameworks, typically around contingency reserves, transmission planning, that sort of thing. 6 years ago, many of the utilities on this slide decided that individual utility planning was not going to work for the long term. There had been some studies that had come out. E3 had done a study in 2018 highlighting a very serious resource adequacy crisis coming at the West. And thus was born the idea 6 years ago for Western Resource Adequacy Program. At the time, I worked for one of these companies, but I came on board to lead this effort 3 years ago because I truly believe in big grid solutions. And this is one of the first and most exciting ideas of how the West puts ideas into action, something that the West has been historically challenged with when it comes to integrating the Western grid outside of California. The thing I need to emphasize about Western Resource Adequacy Program that is a standalone resource adequacy program voluntarily stood up by the companies on this list. They believed it was the right thing to do. They came up with a framework. I'll talk about the framework in a moment. Because we're not an ISO or an RTO, our only real incentive to get the correct behavior out of the participants is to have a tariff on file with FERC, which we were approved for in 2023. And that tariff includes pretty steep deficiency charges for entities who are resource inadequate, who otherwise fail to meet their obligations in the operations or planning timeframes. 6 years ago, we did not think we would ever really need these deficiency charges. We were looking at an on-ramp for 2027 or potentially earlier to fully operationalize all aspects of the program. And it seemed we were going to be in good shape, but a lot has changed over the last few years, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Here are some of the fundamentals about RAP. There's nothing particularly innovative about RAP. What's innovative about it is that the West has never had a wide area resource adequacy program. So in that sense, it's very groundbreaking for the West. But in terms of the metrics, how we apply capacity accreditation, nothing is terribly out of the box here. It's really that we're doing this in a voluntary construct. RAP is a huge footprint. I hope you took that away from that last slide. And so we have therefore used pretty conservative applications when it comes to looking at that footprint. We haven't made any assumptions about the ability to receive physical firm imports from other regions. It's assumed to operate entirely within the RAP because of the size of that footprint. And we have some pretty conservative requirements for showing us that you do, in fact, have a sufficient amount of firm transmission to make the whole thing work. Our timeline has always been in our tariff that by the time we got to 2025, our 2-year planning cycle, we would automatically throw everyone into the binding program, all compliance requirements fully engaged, deficiency charges in effect. We had the option in the tariff to go live earlier. And every time we got to that deadline, the decision of the participants was, we're not ready. Let's kick the can down the road. But here we are. It is almost October 31st, 2025, which is the deadline in our program for letting us know if you plan to leave the program. If you do not provide an exit notice by Friday, this very Friday, Halloween of all things, then you are automatically in our winter 27 binding program. So the good news for me here is that on November 1, I will have a binding program. No more messing around with non-binding, the kind of data quality that we get from the participants. We can finally move to using the full force and effect of the tariff and to deliver the full value of the program. So that's the upside. The downside is that I never, 6 years ago certainly, and even 3, anticipated that the exit deadline was anything of merit. I really thought we had everybody. It seemed that was the direction the participants were going, but a lot has changed in this space. And so just to keep it spicy and interesting, I'll give you some speculation about what things look like today and what things might look like on Saturday. So I do not have very many formal notices of exit yet. I have one. NV Energy has formally given us a letter saying they're going to leave. And I have a letter from Pacificor and a letter from Portland General Electric citing a number of concerns that they have with the program. So it's a reasonable amount of speculation to assume that I have at least those 3 companies that will be giving me an exit notice come Friday. And the other thing I would observe about those companies is they are all extended day ahead market leaning companies. So one could further infer that I may receive yet more exit notices that fall along those lines. Some of the concerns noted in these letters include the fact that our how we're going to share the capacity and the operations time frame is clunky and inefficient. It's all done day ahead and can be communicated to markets, but doesn't fully yield the efficiency of what a market engine could do. That is one of the design changes that we're tackling over the next 2 years. We will solve that problem working with our market operator neighbors. Nevertheless, being conservative, I would predict I have a number of entities that fall along market lines that will be exiting the program. Now, I think the good news, and certainly the thing that helps me sleep at night, is they can come back, and I hope that they do. We will work so hard to deliver all of the evolutions for RAP that they have cited that they want. The thing that we're all working so hard towards is the wide area view, the transparency, the accountability, and then most importantly, the ability to leverage this tremendous amount of savings through the diversity of that footprint. All technical problems are solvable. The bigger problems around this market or that market have really taken a hit in the West. And I think RAP might be one of those things that's kind of had to take a step back because of collateral damage around the different market pulls that are going on in the West. The good news is I have other letters. So many letters have been written the last couple of weeks. But I have a letter from 11 entities in RAP who highly align with Markets Plus leaning. And they have all said, we are not giving you an exit notice. We are committed to this program. These numbers might be off. If you are from one of these markets, please don't complain. This is approximate. We got these values from different places. We really meant to show that with the committed entities, RAP is still a large and appreciable resource adequacy program. We are going to be able to move forward on Saturday and the 2 years that come after it and the many years that I hope come after that with a viable program. Maybe we'll get some of those other entities back. I think the last thing I want to say, and I know I'm taking too much time, but a lot's going on right now, is that we have always committed that we know resource adequacy is hard everywhere on planet Earth. It's not anywhere easily done. And so therefore RAP is evolutionary, and we've always committed to have a long list of things we're working on. This slide shows all the different stuff that we're going to work on in the next 2 years, realigning our footprints with the markets so that we can get the most efficient partnership with those markets to share the holdback obligations in RAP, looking at what new large transmission could do to bring increased efficiency or savings to our planning metrics. We've got a lot to do. And I think for me, trying to be optimistic and leave that there is the idea of working with a group of entities that are truly committed and ready to take the benefits and the burdens of a binding program is a very exciting moment, even if, especially with my particular background, having worked at a couple of these companies that will be leaving, I'm disappointed. But I remain optimistic that we'll get them back and we will still have a very large resource adequacy program. And then I think our big challenge looking ahead, and which is really a lot of the focus of the speakers up here, is once we do that and we establish that, what are our relationships with California resource adequacy or across the Rockies? What additional conversations and efficiencies can be gained through that next evolutionary step for us? Looking forward to questions. I'll turn it to Andrew.
Good afternoon. Look at that. We've already got my slides. So little introduction here. I'm Andrew French, Chair of the Kansas Corporation Commission, and I know this is a technical workshop, but I think I'm going to have to talk a little bit about RTO governance to explain to you why a state regulator is here to talk to you about regional resource adequacy assessments and even getting into wide area assessments. And yes, I'm very aware I'm deep in the heart of PJM right now, so I'll try not to be too controversial on RTO governance, but we have a different model in my region. So Kansas falls squarely within the Southwest Power Pool. I probably should have included a slide showing the footprint, but most of you are, I'm sure, aware. It's the central portion of the country, the plains, going from Canada all the way down to the non-ERCOT portions of Texas. Okay, governance. Like some other regions, SPP has a regional state committee. Ours is called the SPP Regional State Committee. It consists of a regulator in each of the SPP member states. And the place we're a little different than some other RTOs is we have a unique governance model where our regional state committee, under the SPP Open Access Transmission Tariff, is actually part of the organization. We are on the org chart. Notably, and very important to the states, we are not under the board of directors. We exercise an independent component of the organization. So we're off to the side. We take our own separate votes, and we have our own areas of authority. This next slide gives you that in very summary fashion, and this explains to you why I'm here talking about resource adequacy. We have 4 areas of authority. Probably the 2 most interesting would be cost allocation and resource adequacy. And the little blurb there is from the SPP bylaws, which are, of course, part of their transmission tariff. And it simply mentions the fact that as the RSC makes decisions on methodologies to address these issues, they have to be filed with FERC. SPP has to file those positions at FERC as a Section 205 filing. So that is the really unique component of the SPP governance model. Definitely some other regions are interested in that. But with that power comes responsibility. And as the state regulators, it then falls to us to tackle those tough issues like resource adequacy. And we have spent a lot of time doing that in recent years, particularly the last probably 3 or 4 years. So, our resource adequacy construct is pretty typical. Probabilistic loss of load expectation study to set our PRMs, traditional 1 in 10 LOLE study. The current PRMs you can see on the screen, 15% in summer, 36% in winter. Those, though, will be moving to 17% in 29, and for the winter, it'll be moving to 38% in 2029. Those percentages, just a few years ago, a couple of years ago, it was 12% in the summer, but obviously, the changing resource mix, but mostly the subtraction of traditional resources is driving that along with load growth. And then we didn't even have a winter PRM, and I'll explain a little bit on that in the future. But those are some of the drivers. The other interesting thing with SPP, we are all completely vertically integrated utilities. We're not restructured. As in this part of the country, you're more versed in that. So when we set up a summer or a winter PRM, it is simply up to our load serving entities to either build that capacity or go out and find a developer who's got it, or to buy it through a bilateral transaction. There is no central capacity market. So I get to read the headlines about all the other regions that deal with a capacity market, but we do not have a capacity market. So I mentioned that there have been a lot of resource adequacy reforms in SPP, just like in every region throughout the country, all facing sort of some of the same issues. We put together what we call our resource and energy adequacy leadership team. That was something that the regional state committee jointly developed with the board of directors and included a lot of stakeholders on that group. This is a sort of the abbreviated list of reforms that we have embarked on. I would say it kind of hits the gamut of everything that a lot of the regions are doing. So as I mentioned, added a winter resource adequacy requirement as we saw a lot of the risk hours shift into the winter season. Definitely sped up by the fact that we had Winter Storm Uri and a couple other winter storms following on. We have changed our accreditation methodologies. It's hard to believe that just a few years ago we were using accreditation that closely matched nameplate capacities, but like most regions, we aren't there anymore, smartly. So the other thing I would say is improvements to generator interconnection, things like ERAs type of proposals that a lot of the regions have done to get more capacity on the grid quickly, but also maybe more interesting proposals. People have asked how we're going to meet the huge load growth when you can only build transmission and generation at a maybe 5 to 10 year time scale. So SPP has something that they've just rolled out called Surplus Plus, and it's trying to develop a more robust way to fully utilize surplus interconnections. So that's another GI enhancement. Couple things we're still working on. You can see there standardized metrics to better value and measure loss of load events. We use EUE now to inform how we view LOLE results. So particularly when we're looking at where the risk hours should fall in the summer and the winter, in developing which one of those PRMs we select. We have usually a range of EUE values that helps us assess where the PRM should really fall in those ranges. But we don't have a standardized normalized EUE that we always point to and helps say this is always going to be the number given the output of the LOLE study. So that's something we're still working on. Still working on a vol. I think that's probably farther away. That's a difficult one for folks. But the one I want to focus on for just a couple slides here, because it feeds into this idea of wide area resource adequacy assessments that Derek has introduced and that the ESIG report introduces, is the value of interregional transfer capability, and particularly non-firm imports, and what's the interplay of that within a resource adequacy study. That's something on the work plan. It's not something that we've done yet in SPP, but it is definitely coming up. Probably by year end of 26, we'll have a firm answer on how we're going to handle that. So today, we do consider imports within our resource adequacy construct if they are firm. So if they have if the resource lies outside of the balancing authority, but it has firm transmission service and it's not committed to satisfy any resource adequacy requirements in the other balancing authority, an entity can count that import against their workbook, or it would be considered there. But for non-firm imports, and that's kind of what we're talking about in this probabilistic assessment, those are not currently considered in our LOLE studies, and they're also not allowed to satisfy load serving entities' resource adequacy requirements. But interestingly, SPP is currently in the process of setting a planning reserve margin for their western balancing area. Most of you are aware that SPP has an expansion going on with several entities within WEC planning region. And so they are considering looking at those non-firm imports for that balancing area. So this slide will get into that a little bit. So just at a super high level, what are the benefits of looking at non-firm imports when you're setting a planning reserve margin? So as it says here, it should result in less capacity or lower planning reserve margins to meet that same LOLE standard. When you consider diversity of load patterns, different time zones in particular would be really helpful to help shift those peaks. And as I mentioned, SPP is currently considering looking at these non-firm imports for the western balancing area. And that's a smaller system. It's probably 5,600 megawatts at peak compared to SPP East, which is 56,000 megawatts at peak. But you can see here, their preliminary analysis shows that including those imports would dramatically decrease the PRMs that those entities would have to take. It takes it down from 28 to 19% in the summer and down from 53 to 40% in the winter. And importantly, it also shifts the risk hours from the winter to the summer, which is really interesting. All right, I'm not going to read every question on this slide, but I do think a couple of these risks are important to point out. So first of all, including non-firm imports this is sort of a drawback, I guess, or something to be considered. Including the non-firm imports in an LLE study to reduce the PRM, it would reduce the PRM, but we have to also keep in mind, it's not going to actually improve resource adequacy by including that. It's just going to give you more visibility into what you might have. Now, the flip side of that, and I put it in parentheses, is if you are able to value it and it incentivizes additional transmission or allows us to value it in the planning process, that actually could improve resource adequacy. Couple reminders though, I mean, these are non-firm and because of that, we don't have any control over them. And that's something everybody always needs to keep in mind. The last bullet point there on risks, Derek told me I can't say data centers, but I'll find the swear jar later. I do think it's worth considering the fact that we have dwindling surplus capacity in each of our balancing areas. And I think it's fair to say that as that surplus capacity goes lower, the value of non-firm imports it's going to diminish. There will be less opportunity for non-firm imports. And so I guess my concern there is not that you shouldn't count them, but you have to be careful that they aren't reducing so fast that you're over counting them, in one planning year. So I'll let you all read my complicated questions because those are the kind of things that are in Derek's report, but I'm sure we're going to get into it in the discussion, but there are a lot of complicated questions about how you value imports in the construct, whether you treat them as a system benefit, whether you accredit them. If you accredit them, who gets credit for that? All good questions that are going to have to be figured out if we go to some sort of construct. So thank you for your time. I will now turn it over to, is it Katoons next?
Thank you, Andrew. We're going to the next slide. This is okay. Yeah, perfect. Thank you for the opportunity to join for this panel discussion on resource adequacy assessment for large geographic regions. Today, I will be focusing on giving an overview of the current resource adequacy assessments that is being performed at NPCC. So who is NPCC? Let me introduce. NPCC is a Northeastern Power Coordinating Council, which is a not-for-profit organization that is responsible for promoting as well as enhancing reliability of the international interconnected grid of the bulk power system. NPCC, through development of regional reliability standards, compliance assessments, as well as enforcement of these regional standard continent-wide through system coordination planning, design and operations, as well as assessment of reliability. Derek talked about wide area with ESIG publishing recently the wide area resource adequacy assessment. In that, even in Derek's presentation slide, defined what wide area is. It means a large interconnected region consisting with utilities, provinces, and multiple states. So when you do a wide area assessment, which includes multiple regional entities that are physically and operationally connected across an entire interconnection, this gets very complex, where coordination planning is going to be very essential. NPCC plays a key role in the wide area approach. Currently, NPCC's geographic region has both summer peaking and winter peaking areas. NPCC region covers New York and 7 states in New England, which is starting from Connecticut all the way to Maine, and it stretches all the way to Maritimes, Quebec, as well as Ontario. Through NPCC's assessment, our goal is to quantify reliability risk, not just under expected condition, but under a stressful situation, whether that's extreme weather, fuel supply disruptions, or unexpected load demand. NPCC's resource adequacy reports highlights both independent efforts and collaboration with NARC and the broader ERO enterprise, and aligns with the evolving vision for wide area energy reliability assessments. At NPCC, we use probabilistic modeling to simulate thousands of scenarios of extreme weather, fuel disruption, demand spike to quantify reliability risks in estimating when and how operating procedures will be needed to avoid any shortages. Similar to NARC, evaluating resource adequacy as well as emerging risks for entire North America, each year NPCC produces and publishes about 4 reports covering NPCC region. These reports are pre-seasonal reliability assessment covering summer and winter. We use probabilistic method to come up to complement our deterministic assessment of the summer and winter. That's our seasonal assessment. We also do a long-range adequacy overview, as well as we review interconnection assist and benefits analysis. These reports that I just highlighted provides essential insights how the NPCC-wide system is expected to perform both seasonally and over the long term, where planned resources can meet, whether planned resources can meet demand under both expected and extreme condition, like heat waves or cold snaps in the Northeast. NPCC performs a long-range adequacy overview. That's the second report I was highlighting, looking over 5 years ahead for expected and expected demand. That's your 50-50 conditions, as well as we do a probabilistic assessment looking at extreme demand forecast. And we evaluate for each one of the 5 areas whether they are meeting the industry standard of loss of load expectation of 1 day in 10 criteria. NPCC also conduct a review of interconnection assistant reliability benefits. We take a close look at each areas within our region, the assumptions that they make to meet the reliability criterion, which is a standard that NPCC puts a specific criteria for its members to meet and to be compliant. So through the review of the interconnection assistant analysis and the report, we basically verify that the assumptions that area are making are reasonable and not overstated, to ensure that each area's resource adequacy assessment reflects a realistic expectation and interconnection support. Next thing I want to talk about where we are, what we're doing to evolve our resource adequacy practices to basically going through, the system is going through energy transition and increasing penetration of variable energy resources to meet the decarbonization goal and electrification goals. So what at NPCC, what we are doing is, as I mentioned, at NPCC, we have a reliability assessment program where our planning coordinators and areas have to demonstrate whether they are meeting each year the loss of load expectation of disconnecting farm load due to resource deficiencies is on average no more than 1 day per year. As part of that demonstration and being compliant at NPCC, we have requested and recommended each area to also include going forward the additional reliability metrics, which will provide us conditions as well as to include climate-driven scenarios part of their assessment each year. The additional metrics are expected unserved energy, UE, loss of load hours, as well as normalized UE. In addition to that, at NPCC, we performed long-range adequacy overview, which at the 5-year out, we study to make sure we're not violating the 1-day intent criteria. This year, we included a scenario-based analysis, which is tailored to the distinct characteristic of each of our 5 NPCC areas. This scenario, we considered regional specific factors that influence reliability. I'll give one example what we considered. Hydro-Quebec, which is Quebec system, is heavily reliant on hydroelectric generation. So as part of our scenario, we accounted a potential drought condition that could impact resource output. And that will be reported, the results will be reported for this year long-range adequacy overview and will be publishing in December. In addition to that, last year, we also standardized how we model wind and solar profiles as part of the wide area probabilistic assessment. What we did was to basically capture simultaneous wind lull or weather-driven variability in the NPCC's multi-area probabilistic reliability assessment. So these are the improvements we have been making. And part of this panel, we are also wanted to talk about where we are going and what's happening for the future direction. Looking ahead, ERO Enterprise advancing its collaborative efforts in energy assessment. We're shifting focus toward a future where energy reliability depends more on energy availability, not just installed capacity. NPCC is collaborating with NARC and other regional entities to conduct a comprehensive interconnection-wide energy and analysis next year. So with that, NPCC is actively updating its resource adequacy framework to embrace a more dynamic, risk-informed approach that reflects the changing energy landscape. Also, we will be continuing to depend on deeper interregional coordination, innovative modeling, and scenario-based analysis. We are strengthening our ability to anticipate and address emerging reliability challenges as we're going toward a more decarbonization. So, thank you. I will introduce Jason from NYISO.
Thank you, Katoon. Good afternoon. I think my presentation should hopefully dovetail really nicely with some of the words we've heard from my fellow panelists here. Instead of taking the wide area view, I'm going to focus in on what I consider wide area, which is all of New York State, all 20 million people, and all of Manhattan as well, upstate New York, lots of great places. So what I want to focus on today in the context of the wide area assessments is how New York ISO and the Reliability Council actually assume and treat our external assistance. There is a unique governance process at New York where the ISO conducts the probabilistic studies, and the New York State Reliability Council is actually the approving entity of the installed reserve margin and sets up our capacity market requirements. So when I speak about the Reliability Council, it's the approving body of the assumptions and the actual end results of the model. But actually, the ESIG report and some of the NPCC and NERC information is extremely valuable. We rely a lot on not just the models themselves that are provided by NPCC from all of our neighbors, but just as important is the standardization of all the metrics and the venue for which we can talk to our colleagues at different areas and understand what risks they're anticipating, understand their scenarios on a deeper level, and really try to take advantage of the diverse supply and system characteristics that we have in the Northeast. So what I'll talk about today is really New York's approach for how we assume emergency assistance, which emergency support, emergency assistance being sort of non-compensated free capacity that we can pull from our ties
New York ISO actually has almost 10 gigawatts of ties with our neighbors. We're interconnected with Hydro-Quebec, ISO New England, PJM, and Ontario. So obviously 10 gigawatts is, almost 30% of our peak load. So on one hand, you could say, let's use all of our tie support and maybe we only need, 30,000 megawatts of supply, but that might be an overly optimistic set of assumptions for when you're operating on your peak day. So utilizing a lot of the information from both NPCC, NERC, and talking to our colleagues at other areas and also our operational data of these extreme events, the Reliability Council and the ISO were really trying to answer the question of how much emergency assistance is actually out there during our peak events, during our extreme events, and at different scenarios. And in this research effort, we really settled on a few key observations. The first one being the Northeast is generally experiencing peak operating conditions around the same time due to climate and weather patterns, with the exception of Hydro-Quebec being a winter peaking system. So there are some benefits and synergistic effects of being intertied with Quebec, and also our neighbors having a lot of tie support from Quebec as well. Secondly, it's intuitive, at least when you talk to your operations colleagues, that as weather events become tighter and load tightens up, you should expect you're going to get less support from your neighbors. On those peak days when it's cool down in PJM, or it's a little bit milder out west, you may get a little bit more support. But if you're both at your 90-10 or 99-1 conditions, you're probably not going to get much emergency energy and deploying of their reserves to help meet New York's reserve requirements or load shed events. And thirdly is really just a risk tolerance approach, which is that in order to really prevent over-reliance on emergency imports, you don't want to just take a model at face value and assume that whatever is coming into your model is going to be there in operations. And so what we actually settled on, and this has been practiced for a number of years, but is continuing, is to really try to limit the reliability level of the modeled system that you have with your neighbors. So for example, you don't want to assume that your neighbors are going to be flush in capacity for the rest of the time. We want to represent a system that's intertied and sort of just has enough to meet their own reliability requirements, and not just let the model dictate how much is coming in for emergency assistance. And so what you see here in the chart is actually representing that as your load conditions get tighter and tighter, you really want to limit how much emergency imports you would allow into your model. And the effect of this was actually pretty meaningful when it comes to the IRM study. So our result after improving our emergency assistance limits here was actually an increase in the margin of 700 some megawatts. So that really tells you that when you start to dial down these emergency limits and take a less optimistic view and try to characterize your system as more coincident in terms of when they're seeing constraints, you actually need another 700 megawatts of local supply to help meet those same reliability needs. So that tells us that we were certainly getting a lot of benefit, but it's not clear that we were able to withstand these if we actually got into those situations and operations. So I was hitting on emergency imports, which are not compensated in the capacity market in the New York system. We do have firm capacity imports like other areas where you have certain transmission projects that not only have firm transmission rights, but also the ability to contract and flow those megawatts in a controllable manner. So we call these UDRs. This is the terminology. It's a little bit abstract, but essentially you have a DC cable that injects into New York State in some load pocket or some local region, and they're able to not just control their megawatts, but also contract supply behind that in the source area. And when they sell capacity, they're able to also take on capacity obligations where they're selling or offering those megawatts into your energy market. When they do get called for shortage events, they're actually ensuring that the megawatts are flowing across the tie and that the generating resource is in fact performing during those events. So obviously these are much more firm than emergency imports when you're sort of hoping and assuming that your neighbors are going to have not just excess reserves, but be willing to deploy their reserves to help meet your emergency needs. And so for that reason, they're compensated in the capacity market. Beyond the concept of firm, though, is the obligation or the expectation of them actually making elections to let us know if they're going to use these rights. Because if they're not going to use these transmission rights, the transmission is still there. And if the supply is behind at the source region, you would assume the transmission could be used for emergency support as well. So this sort of balance allows us to recognize the transmission and the value it provides, but also allow that the capacity and the transmission together to be compensated in the capacity market. So lastly, I'm going to hit on something more related to the market side. We heard Andrew talking about the difficulty, when you have transmission and emergency support, it may not be actually helping your resource adequacy from a conceptual level. The capacity that we are receiving in emergency assistance is only as good as when there's actually supply behind it. So one thing that New York is facing, and I think I can speak for a lot of other areas as well, is the tightening reserve margins, a lot of uncertainty in load growth. In New York, we're seeing a lot of retirements in generation that are somewhat a combination of both policy, but also economics. And so as you're counting on more and more sort of emergency support, and you can have these great studies and a lot of information that can support how much your neighbors could provide you, you're entering a phase where you don't want to prematurely force retirements. So my point being, the more and more emergency support you count on, you may actually be minimizing or reducing your price signal for not just new entry, but also the retainment of the units that you may need as you go into these uncertain times. So all that to say that emergency support is incredibly meaningful to your capacity market, but also it's important that you factor in your capacity that you need on the system, not just for new growth and new development, but also retaining resources that you may need. And you don't want to mute that price signal when you're even taking a sort of more pessimistic look at how much is out there. So thank you.